Go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to August's cyber briefing. I'm Lauren Frickel, marketing manager here at CynergisTek. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. There are a few buttons on the left side of the screen that we'll use today. Use the chat button to engage in conversation with the entire group or our speakers, and use the Q&A button to post your questions. We have planned for a Q&A segment today at the end of our last session, Ben's session. As a heads up, this briefing is being recorded and will be available to stream here in this Eventry platform by the end of the day. Also, for any of you who are new and would like to look back at previous briefing recordings or slide shares, we'll be sending a follow-up email with those links, and we'll also drop them into the chat right now. Last, a little announcement. CynergisTek's cyber briefings have been approved to earn you HIMSS certification continuing education credits. For details on how to claim your CEUs for both HIMSS and CHIME certifications, scroll to the bottom of the page in the link I am about to drop. Now, before I turn the mic over, I ask that you, our audience, remain muted and keep your cameras off until we get to the Q&A segment. During the Q&A segment, please feel free to engage in conversation on camera and on mic if you feel. Now, let's start today's session. Mac, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome everybody to today's this month's session. This month, I'm joined by Dave Bailey, as you guys, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with already. Dave is our VP of Security Services and has spent many years in both the DoD government space as well as the healthcare space as a CISO for a large health institution, and then joining CynergisTek, and has been with us for many years and runs our security services group. And then Ben Denkers, who is our executive vice president for innovation, and Ben is responsible for developing new solutions, finding new vendors, evaluating technologies that we want to integrate into services and for our clients. And he comes from a really deep background in cybersecurity as well. And I'm not sure who's going through the slides right now, but I wish they'd stop. All right, so let's go to the next slide. All right, we know it's our Cyber August update. So as you guys all know, I start off by talking about things that are happening around the community each month, or we've seen in the previous month. And I try to tie these to the topics that we're going to have today. Which I'm really excited about listening to Dave and Ben when they get started. But it was really interesting. There are several major reports that came out in the last month, many of which I'm sure you're familiar with, like the Verizon DBIR and several other big reports. What's interesting I saw in there is that we're still seeing error as continuing to be a dominant trend, if you will, in breaches that occur. And we're still seeing that people are very much at the center of a lot of the incidents that we have, which just goes to the point that we need to continue to make sure that security education is a continuous thing. And we need to constantly remind everybody to be diligent and pay attention to what's going on with their computer and with their workflow, and make sure that anything that doesn't seem right, that they stop and question it and ask somebody before they click or open something or fill something out or submit anything, because it's costing us when we make those mistakes. We had a Marriott employee who was duped by Anonymous. This was a classic social engineering attack where they basically contacted the individual and convinced them that they were a legitimate person looking for information for a legitimate reason. That person then gave them access, which they then used to gain access to quite a bit of data with respect to documents, flight information, and corporate credit card information as well. But as you know, Anonymous is a hacktivism organization, and they typically go after targets in particular for some reason. So it'll be interesting to see who Anonymous was actually targeting in this attack in terms of the information that they took. and what that's gonna turn into. Supply chain, which you're going to hear Ben talk about again, is one of those things that's a one-to-many problem, as we're beginning to see that attackers are going right past the breach and maintaining the access, because what they're finding is that if you attack one organization, you have one opportunity, but if you attack another organization that is providing services to a number of organizations, you now have many opportunities for extortion or whatever it is that you're going after. And then last but not least, just to make sure everybody, and not that you aren't, but keeps an eye on it, ransomware still accounts for almost 25% of the incidents that we see out there. And the top 4 vectors that were identified that led to ransomware attacks were things like desktop sharing or RDP services, email, web applications, and things that directly attacking the system. Next slide. So cyber events in July, 20 plus data breaches in healthcare alone. More than half reported more than half of the incidents that were reported in July. It means we're still very much a very targeted industry, and we need to stay diligent. Breach effects affecting homeless or those escaping home environments were on the rise for whatever reason this last month. There were multiple organizations that were attacked or had incidents that served those communities that provide support to the homeless or individuals that are trying to get away from abusive environments and sheltering women and children. One of those was the people concern as an example. But this is something that we need to really pay attention to, obviously, because they're going after folks that are already in distress, if you will. And then last but not least, this one here, I always, as a grandfather and a father, I'm always concerned when I see things that I know can affect children or young people. And this one here, a popular comic book reading program called Megatoon, was hacked, and 23 million subscribers' data was stolen, and then discovered when it was posted on I Have Been Pawned. And the attacker actually provided samples of the information that they were able to take from Megatoon, and they have promised that depending on how this thing plays out, that they may actually post the rest of the data as well. So I'm not real sure who uses Megatoon to read comic books, but apparently a lot of people do. I'm guessing that some of them are young. So I don't know if any of you have anybody using that application, or if you are, but you might want to pay attention to that, and especially if you have children that are using that app on their phone or their pad or what have you. Next slide. And I throw this out because one of the things we're seeing is that a lot of these attacks, as you'll see in the Verizon report, are literally external. The biggest threat today in healthcare is external threats, not internal. And what they're attacking most often are things that are web enabled. What is a web enabled or web application attack? And it's an attack against our most exposed infrastructure, web applications, web servers, etc. Usually it involves stealing credentials or exploiting a known vulnerability. Again, 2 of the other high priority or high rated threats, if you will, in all the reports and incidents that we're seeing. The difference here is who's doing this. Well, there's a whole host of APT and cyber criminal organizations that are doing this, and they're very well financed, very well resourced, and there are numerous tools that they use to go after web applications. So paying attention to your web enabled services and your web applications, etc., is something that you really need to focus on. When you look at the impact of all this, of the 571 confirmed data disclosures, web applications was the #1 vector so identified in that Verizon report. And web app attacks are trending higher in healthcare than in other industries. So they affect all parts of our business because we're doing all kinds of things remotely now, or through web-enabled services or applications or what have you. So we really need to pay attention to this as we go forward. Next slide. What hasn't changed? Well, the frequency of incidents hasn't changed. It continues to go up. We're looking at about 19 incidents a day across all industries, about 5 a day, 5 to 6 a day in healthcare with data disclosure. The threat actors, 93% of them are now external, as opposed to back in 2015 when our biggest threat was internal. Motivation still is financial. It's all about the money. Data is no longer the target. It's the means. It's leverage to get to the money. And the things that have been most exposed are credentials, because credentials give them access to do other things, personal information, other information, and then internal. Bottom line is that these things are continuing. They're continuing at a high rate, and they're trying to get to your data primarily to be able to exploit or to leverage you for other purposes, but which is primarily extortion of money. Next slide. I bring this up once again just to keep everybody on their toes. There were multiple reports in July of cyber attacks by the Ukrainians against the Russians, and by Russians and pro-Russian groups against Ukraine and other European countries, and even some US targets. So it's just something that we got to continue to pay attention to until this scenario plays itself out. Next slide. All right, so we're going to get to our segue to our speakers today. Today we're going to be talking about what I call operational awareness, right? You remember I talked to you about Chesty. He was the colonel that was surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. He had a clear problem. He was surrounded, and he had a clear strategy. He knew he needed to attack, but he still needed a plan. And it's the same no matter where you are or what situation you find yourself in. Every commander has to understand his or her own weaknesses and strengths, and have insight into the current performance that enables line of sight to success. And that's what Dave's going to be talking about today when he talks about KPIs. And he's got a punchline that I want you all hopefully to be listening to when he's talking about that, because that's really what's most important. And then after him, we're going to talk about another part of our attack surface, which is that supply chain, which again, the commander has to understand his attack surface or his battlefield. And the attack surface that we have today is way more complicated than it used to be. And a large risky component of that is the supply chain. Next slide. There we go. So I saw Dave show up. So Dave, take it away and tell us about KPIs.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And today I plan on discussing metrics and KPIs for cybersecurity. I hope to leave you with today a framework and a process to help you develop them, and more importantly, why do you have to do it, and how you can go about selecting the metrics that are important to you. Next slide. And one more, please. All right, why define KPIs and metrics? I think there's 4 key areas to really focus on. The first is, it'll enable a security program to be able to measure effectiveness. I think ultimately it comes down to understanding that the investments that you've made and the things that you have in place, the people, process, and technology, are doing what you expect them to do. In order to do that, you want to be able to achieve predictable outcomes. And whenever we assess a control, normally we look at, do you have the process? Does it meet its purpose? And if you want to be able to make sure that that's predictable, having KPIs and metrics will certainly make that process predictable, and be able to allow you to optimize it. Another key thing is certainly to make sure that the program is aligned with the business. I think cybersecurity is extremely important to be embedded into the fabric and the culture of an organization, and it really needs to make sure that that how you're going about safeguarding information and ensuring that the business can operate, you have to align with the business goals. And where the rubber meets the road for the Chief Information Security Officer, it's extremely important to be able to say that they can achieve situational awareness. You have to know what the current state is. You have to understand what the threats are in front of you right now, what is happening to you right now, and metrics and KPIs can help you do that. Next slide. If I could give two pieces of advice to a CISO today, the first one I would give to them is ensure your program is risk-based, that you can manage your program from a risk perspective. What does that mean? That you know the organization's risk appetite, and ultimately you can quickly and accurately determine impact, and understanding risk and managing to risk. That's a key component to it, is to say, what is my threat? What is the likelihood? What is the impact? What does it mean to me? And how do I have to respond to it? The second thing, which I think is extremely important in today's world, is data-driven decision-making. We are at a point with digital transformation where the human process, while it's extremely important, is not enough to keep up with what is happening from a digital transformation age. You cannot survive today successfully, in my opinion, without understanding data, using data to make decisions. And from a security perspective, you need to be able to determine, am I under attack? Can I respond quickly enough? What are the impacts to me? Next slide. So what does good look like? So a KPI and a metric is all about being able to support an information security program. What makes up a good program? I think there's three key aspects to it. Having good governance, that's alignment of goals. Who owns the risk? It's extremely important. And being able to prioritize. Those are things that the metrics and KPIs can help with. You have to have good risk management in a security program. That's understanding lifecycle management. You're going to hear from Ben shortly about third-party risk and ultimately your ability to be able to respond to incidents. And the last part, and an extremely important part in an information security program, is how you conduct cybersecurity operations. And this is all of the blocking and tackling that is required. This is your ability to monitor and detect cyber attacks. And in the event you do have one, can you respond to it? And do you have the ability to recover your data in the event that you have an adverse effect? Next slide, please. So you have all of these things that make up that good security program. You have the governance tier, which is it has multiple functions and facets to it. You have risk management that you have to take care of, and then all of the components that cybersecurity operations entail. So how do I go about what process should I use to be able to help define metrics and KPIs? Next slide. First and foremost is the establishment of goals and initiatives for a security program. Ultimately, if the organization has a strategy and has documented, here's where we are and here's where we're going, the security program can get in alignment with that. Here's some samples of what goals and initiatives could look like to start. How you formalize governance, expand risk management, you align with business continuity. I think most importantly, you have to look at, can you protect according to risk? I think that's really important. And then if you have a goal and an initiative to be able to measure and report, it certainly helps you, prioritize resources to be able to implement the things that you need to collect on those metrics. Next slide. All right, so if one of the keys that I want to leave today here is that I think there's 4 functional categories that you could put metrics and KPIs in. These 4 categories are operational indicators, compliance indicators, incident and risk mitigation indicators. First, let's talk a little bit about operational indicators. Really, when it comes down to both numbers and trends, so you want to have the the numbers of everything, and you want to be able to trend. You want to know threats, and these are just examples of what you can have in that. So there's threats, there's attempts. Today, certainly with privileged users being, a number one target, just the credential itself is a number one target. Most of the threat actors are not only going after those creds, but they're also then taking that information, using privilege escalation, and attacking your network. So it's really important to understand about really important things, and privileged users are extremely important in today's environment. All your assets, you cannot protect anything without knowing what you have to protect. So those are extremely important indicators to have, as well as infrastructure change. So these are all the things that manage that life cycle development, and what are the tools and indicators that can help a security program along with that journey. The next level is compliance indicators. I do want to point out, I am not talking, when I say compliance indicators, about compliance of framework. While compliance of frameworks like HIPAA and NIST are extremely important, from a metrics perspective, it's really important to look at compliance of your standards. So these are things like, where am I with patching? Where am I against my documented standards in the organization? Things like hardening and encryption and all the things all of those safeguards that you want to have in place. You want to be able to see if everything in your environment has those safeguards. So it's extremely important to develop compliance indicators. And these are things like phishing awareness and users trained. How are you doing as far as alignment to your provisioning policy? Do you do audits? And then, one of the key things in the last part of the attack, in the event that you do have an attack, is, can you get that data back? So what are the indicators to make sure that you have good data backup, you're able to recover your system, your process, your environment? The next ones are around incidents. This is extremely important in today's threat landscape. When you are dealing with security operations centers, when you're dealing with managed security providers, or maybe your own internal teams, it's extremely important that you have good situational awareness on what incidents do I have, what are their types, their severities, how long did it take me to respond to that incident? It's extremely important. How long does it take to resolve it? What do I have open? What do I have closed? Because this really is your first line of defense. Today's world, it is not about being able to stop or drive risk to zero. It's about, can you minimize the impact? You're not going to drive the impact to zero, but you can minimize it. And those are things that are extremely important, is to be able to understand, how long can it take me to resolve? How quickly can I determine what the impact of an incident is? And those are things that your security operations center can assist with and provide you that situational awareness. Lastly, talk about risk mitigation. These are things like, when you have risk assessments, what risks have been identified to you? What are their statuses? Are they mitigated? Are they accepted? And if you are working and mitigating those, it's extremely important from a governance perspective to understand what that tracking is, where they are, so you can ultimately keep track of your overall risk posture. There's one thing that I left out, very specific in the risk mitigation functional area that I described here. Everywhere else, I said I think it's important to have numbers and trends. Risk, I would caution anyone that takes a trending approach to risk, only because when you're dealing with risk, it's a snapshot in time based upon a threat assessment. And what that threat assessment was maybe a year ago to what that threat assessment is today can be vastly different. And the threat landscape changes so much that, just because I had so many high risks or what my risk posture was a year ago, and that risk posture may look worse this year, it really comes down to understanding what the threat landscape is. And we certainly saw that once COVID hit, once these threat actors turned their attention to healthcare. And really what you have now is you literally have a threat actor that's going to be inside your network potentially for several days before they detonate ransomware, which means, these are very serious things to deal with. And that landscape wasn't like that a few years ago. So It's important to keep track of what risks you have and mitigation, but I would just lay caution to anyone about actually trending that risk year over year time, over a time period. Next slide. All right, so what's the process and roadmap? In the ideal world, if the organization had their strategy, goals, and objectives documented, and you had the plan as a security officer, official, you can take that plan and you can align with your own information security strategy, goals, and objectives. And then you can take those operational indicators that, the overall functional areas like operational indicators, compliance, incident, or risk, and you can start to tie those things to what's important for your program. Next slide. And you can never go wrong with letting the NIST CSF be your guide. So as you look at what those indicators are, ultimately what I like about the NIST is broken out into 5 functional areas. You have to be able to identify all the things that you have to protect. So building metrics and KPIs to do that is extremely important. You cannot protect anything that you don't know about. And those are things that are extremely important to make sure that you have full situational awareness so you can ensure that your environment is as secure as possible. You have to be able to demonstrate that the safeguards that are supposed to be in place are there. Can you monitor? Can you detect the threat? Can you respond? Once again, can you respond in enough time? Because ultimately it comes down to minimizing the impact. And in the event that you had to recover your data, are you able to do that? So what are the things that you can track in order to make sure that you have good data, you have the ability, and you feel confident in your ability to be able to recover that data, that system, so you can keep the business going. And next slide. And ultimately, the bottom line, and I think what is most important in a very complex world today in security, if the metric you're collecting doesn't tell you that you're secure and doesn't tell you that effective, it's probably not a good metric. You have to make sure you can demonstrate that you're secure. So use that as your guidance, use the process, use the framework, and really define things that can help you inform your organization from a risk standpoint and ultimately say, are you secure? With that said, I'm excited to turn today's conversation over to Ben Denkers, our Chief Innovation Officer. And Ben's going to talk about third-party risk and shared responsibility. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. It's great to be here to join in the discussion today. My name is Ben Denkers. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at CynergisTek. I've spent roughly the last 20 plus years in security consulting and have a background with an emphasis in risk management and incident response. Today, I'm really going to try and cover why third-party risk or why third-party supply chain risk is a shared responsibility and give you some ideas on how to tackle the problem. Next slide, please. It's important to start with a broad overview, I think, of the compromises we're seeing in the real world. I think it really comes at no surprise that breaches and compromises aren't slowing down. This particular graph, which was pulled from June's healthcare data breach report, highlights around 700 healthcare breaches that have been reported roughly in the last 12 months. If we put an average on this, it works out to be about 60 breaches or compromises per month. These figures don't even begin to cover the other industries that are routinely impacted or attacked. Why should we really care about that, or what should we think about? Well, if we take a second to recognize that a lot of these third parties that healthcare entities use aren't only doing business with healthcare, right? So they produce additional risk. This becomes really important as we start to talk about how frequently third parties are targeted and compromised. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the most used statistics when talking about incident costs. It comes from IBM's data breach report and highlights that the average cost of compromises is doing nothing but going up. Having done incident response for some of the largest breaches, I can attest to you that the $4 million price tag in some of the cases that I have worked wouldn't even have covered the consulting bill, right? And so we're routinely seeing specific healthcare examples where these costs are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This could potentially be from the attack, revenue loss, or even lawsuits due to data exposure. When we're talking about these large costs, the first thing everyone usually jumps to is cyber insurance as a form of risk transference. If you haven't had a chance to see what most organizations are using for those requirements, I encourage you to go and take a look because the prerequisites are often tall order. On top of that, simply some of those organizations have removed coverage altogether and/or the costs have been increased tenfold where they become cost prohibitive. Either way, I think compromises are expensive, and this kind of shows you that nobody really wants to pay for them, even insurance. But ultimately, the individual or the organization is going to be responsible for ensuring and footing that bill. Next slide, please. This is the one slide, or I should say, this is the one takeaway that I want you guys to remember. 62% of compromises involve partners. This statistic came from this year's Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. It's staggering and very concerning, right? Especially considering how relatively immature most organizations are in managing supply chain risk. What I also find compromising is how big of an increase this percentage was compared to last year. Partner compromises were almost non-existent in previous Verizon reports, and it just shows the growth on this particular attack segment. If we look at today's set of threats and we start to talk about things like SolarWinds or Log4j, or even start digging into specific vendors like Kronos, we can certainly see that these type of issues and compromises are becoming more mainstream. We start to see the real impact a compromise can have, even if it's not us, but a vendor that we might rely on, right? I think a lot of times it's hard to see kind of that downstream effect, but every organization needs a solid plan on how to deal and manage third-party risk. Next slide, please. Knowing that partners are being actively targeted, the first question to ask is, who has your data? Can you trust them? Are you doing all the things you expect them to? How do you validate those things? Do you have contractual agreements that help not only protect your data, but ensure that if your vendor is compromised, that they accept responsibility and liability? This is really just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide. Let me start off by saying vendors absolutely have a responsibility to help keep data safe. Just as important, you as the data owner or organization effectively need to set and enforce those requirements. The concept of shared responsibility certainly isn't new. If you guys are familiar, shared responsibility is a way that cloud providers generally highlight and showcase who's responsible for what in terms of storage and security and things of that nature. However, in this case, I've tried to adapt it at a high level to the supply chain problem. As an organization, the first thing you need to understand is really the business relationship with the supplier. This is everything from what data do they have, how critical are they to your organization, where is the data stored, or even who has access, who owns the business decisions, et cetera, et cetera. The next thing that you really need to be able to evaluate is the risk. And I want to take a second here and kind of emphasize that it's not just cyber risk, right? You potentially have financial concerns. Are those organizations going to be around and be able to meet your needs in 6 months? Maybe there's quality control issues that need to be evaluated and so on. So cyber risk really in the terms of third party plays an important role, but it's not the only role that you need to think of or be aware of. These risks can sometimes be tricky to navigate, especially if your organization doesn't have any defined requirements that vendors must follow. It also, I should mention, isn't a one-time thing. You really need to ensure vendors are meeting your requirements and expectations. That's your job and your responsibility. You should be building enforcement into contracts where it makes sense. The stronger the language you have around requirements, the easier it's going to become to enforce and validate the things that you're trying to have in place, right? And it just gives it teeth. And so when oftentimes you can ask a vendor for something and they may not be willing to provide it, or they're slow. Well, if they have a contractual obligation to do so, they're much more motivated and allows you to assess the situation that much quicker. Also, if a vendor is compromised, for example, or perhaps has a major outage, is planning on making changes, et cetera, you want to become aware of those situations to potentially help yourself become better prepared for whatever the problem that might arise is. And so building those notifications into contracts, for example, help provide you with a leg up and as advanced notice as you possibly can get. On the flip side, I would say that vendors are going to be responsible for the technical safeguards that are ensuring your data and environments are safe. They should have mature policies in place that guide them on how to do things in a proper and secure manner. The vendor themselves needs to be continuous validating risk. This could be through things like pen testing or risk assessments or other types of activities. And lastly, they need to make sure that they have a solid business continuity plan, incident response plan, disaster recovery plan in place. So if a compromise were to happen, you know that they have a method to manage that and to recover quickly. Here's the trick though, right? Is you still, as the organization doing business with the vendor, have the shared responsibility to make sure they're doing everything that I just talked about. If I broke this down into kind of like a tactical example, I'd have to use something called, I'd probably use RACI. And so for those who are unfamiliar, RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And if I were to give you a specific example, I would say I'm an organization and I'm using a vendor to house some very important data. And so if I would break out who would be responsible in terms of that RACI, I would say the vendor is responsible for developing and having a BCP or incident response plan. As I move down to kind of accountability would be somewhat shared, because from my perspective, if their plan is insufficient, yet the services delivered by that vendor are critical, then the organization is still going to feel or be impacted kind of by those downstream effects of the issue regardless. Consulted of the RACI chart, as the customer, I'd want to make sure that BCP or incident response plan met my standards. Having a process really doesn't mean anything if it's a terrible process, right? And so these are all aspects that we need to take into consideration. And then lastly, the informed. As the customer, I'd want to have contractual agreements in place that I've already previously mentioned to make sure that I knew every time there was a major incident. Could be a threat, could be an outage, or even a network change. Anything that could potentially disrupt my services, especially since in this case, the example I used is critical to my business. Tactically breaking it down really starts to help showcase how third-party risk is truly shared. Next slide, please. All right, so what should organizations be evaluating? If you're up to some light reading, and I say that somewhat jokingly, NIST 800-161-R1, Rev 1, I should say, outlines the controls that should be used when evaluating vendors. It was recently updated this year, I believe in May, and there are a lot of areas, as you can see on this list, that a vendor must get right. Some of those areas probably have more weight depending upon what they're doing for you. But in general, areas like access control, perhaps contingency planning, or incident response are obviously more critical. All of these areas, though, help paint a picture of how mature that organization might be. Basing your third-party risk management program off of this structure, like we do, ultimately will help ensure that you're not introducing vendors that might perhaps add additional or unnecessary risk to your organization. You really just need to remember that they may be responsible for the tactical execution of all of these activities, whether it be making sure patches are being deployed on the systems that they have, or making sure that multi-factor authentication is enabled. But it's your job to make sure that it's done correctly, and contractually you have the power to ensure that it's meeting your requirements. Next slide, please. I really just want to walk you kind of through an example process of evaluating a vendor. Once you have a vendor identified, the process kicks off, right? So discussions and documentation is requested from the vendor. That would then be analyzed. Gaps would be reviewed. I would say it's important to note that not all answers are created equal, and the devil's in the details. Asking the question, for example, do you have multi-factor authentication, might get you a yes from the vendor. However, if you're more specific, do you have multi-factor authentication for both internal and external accounts? 99% of the time, it's a no. And so you have to be able to evaluate the answer and really understand if that's the complete answer. Another common problem that we see is if we ask them, do they have the ability to see a compromised account, for example? Generally, the default answer is yes. Then you ask them to walk through that process, and pretty quickly you can see that there's discrepancies in their ability to do what they said that they're able to do. And so it's more than just an automated, being able to automate this process and have them answer a questionnaire. You really do have to spend the time to analyze the answers, have the discussions with them, review the documentation, and look for those key discrepancies in order to identify the gaps. This is really critical in helping ensure that they're not just check mark. It's not just a check mark process, and you're really evaluating what the risk is to your organization. So once you've kind of gone through this process with a vendor, analyze the risk, at that point, then you need to make a determination as to what you're going to do with them. Oftentimes, we find that vendors have large gaps. Some of those gaps may need to be fixed prior to submitting them or having them finish the onboarding process. If that's the case, then a remediation effort needs to kick off. You need to be able to track those and close them out and then onboard them as needed. In some cases, the vendor may push back and say, hey, we're not going to do this. And you, as the business, need to make a decision as to whether or not that's an acceptable risk, right? And so that's a joint decision that needs to be made by the data owner and the business owner of the organization and the enterprise, whether or not it's going to be acceptable or not. And then lastly, this is not a one-time deal, right? So we're going to continue to do this process and evaluate how well organizations are continuing to progress their security programs, their risk posture. As threats change, so do the requirements. And so, generally vendors get reviewed either biannually or annually, and this is an ongoing evolution of a process. And I think that's important to remember. Also, for a true vendor management program, again, this is really just a set of steps to evaluate risk. There's a lot else that goes into that process, right? Including things like having them do an offboarding process and whether or not they're going to be able to provide the right level of service for whatever it is that you're trying to use them for. But it gives you an idea of where to start. Next slide. So from a last thoughts perspective, it's really okay to trust vendors, right? But that trust can't be confused with transferring the risk. At the end of the day, it's your organization that's going to be in the crosshairs. This is much like any cyber-related activity. It's not a one-time thing, right? Threats change, everything changes. It's a continual process. You have to evolve not only your risk management strategy, not only your evaluation process, but just what you're asking, what your requirements are. It's a continuous, ongoing process. And then, of course, don't forget the offboarding process. When you're done with a vendor, the thing that you need to make sure of is that they don't have access to the data or that it's been sufficiently wiped. A lot of times what we see is that this is a misstep, and it's something that I think you guys should be absolutely aware of. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt for questions.
All right. Thank you, Ben. And Dave, if you want, you can join us as well. So if I can get Dave and Ben back on screen. All right. So, Lauren, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions at this time. To our audience, if you have any questions for our speakers or any discussion points, please upload them to the Q&A button.
Yeah, we'll give you a couple of minutes. And remember, we not only look forward to your questions, but we also look forward to your suggestions for future topics. So, in fact, the two topics we talked about today actually came from questions that audience members asked in the past.
Yeah, Mac and Ben, if I may add, I think listening to to some of this discussion in preparation and knowing the types of discussions that we're having with folks today, You know, all of us in this industry, we know what has to be done, right? We know that it's really important to understand impact and have, you know, business impact analysis done, and it's important to understand risk and all the things. That there's nothing new that has come out that is going to make this any better. But what is happening today is it demonstrates how important it is that those things are really done and they give you the answer that they need. Because when it comes to putting that trust in a vendor, it really comes down to, you still have to be able to operate your business. You have to, you know, understand the business function that it performs. And what are you going to do in the event that there's a cyber attack and that function isn't there for you? And, you know, we certainly saw that with Kronos. We saw that with, you know, what the whole, not even healthcare, what had to be done with Log4j was amazing. You know, some of the work efforts that went into Log4j and just, you know, SolarWinds. So it's really important to dust those plans and things off. It's like the impact is important. The prioritization.
Well, I think to your point, Dave, it's what's important is that we focus in on risk. I mean, for years and years, we have been preoccupied with compliance and with grades and with numbers and trending, et cetera, and that has not, as everybody has experienced, stopped the threat from continuing to take people to task, right? And we really need to focus on answering the question: am I secure? You know, do I know where my gaps are? Do I know where my weaknesses are? Do I know what my strengths are? Am I focusing on those things? And where I do have a gap, do I have compensatory measures to help me understand when one of those is being taken advantage of, so that I can get ahead of whatever's about to come at me, right? And understand that you know, security, unlike compliance, unlike a lot of other things, it's not black and white, right? It's not yes or no. It's not up or down. It's messy. It changes constantly. It changes with the threat. It changes with the technology. It changes with what people do. It changes with things operational changes we make. And so whatever is right today is not right tomorrow. And we know that. Those of us who've worked in it for years know that it constantly evolves, because every time we close a door, the threat looks for another door, looks for another thing. And you know, I used to tell my guys this all the time, that you know, the difference between the classic person in IT who is trying to get a system to do what it's supposed to do, what the manual says it's supposed to do, right? They set it up according to the manual and their standards and whatnot, and it's supposed to do the X, Y, and Z. The hacker looks at a system and says, what will it do that it's not supposed to do? What if I do this, or what if I do that, or what if I inject this code or this script or this, you know, what if I try this? And so it's they're looking for things that we haven't, that when I say we, meaning the folks that are actually managing those systems haven't looked for, because they're not expected to look for those things. And so in security, we have to constantly be asking that same question: what if? And if we're not, then we're going to be behind. It's just that simple. But we really need to, you know, I mean, don't get me wrong. There is a place for compliance. There is a place for standards. There's a place for audits, et cetera. But the thing that we have to really focus on in security is understanding our risk and asking the question, are the things that we're doing effective? Are they truly effective? Right? Not just that they're deployed, not just that we have them, but that they're behaving effectively. So it doesn't matter that you have endpoint security if nobody's listening to what it's telling you. It doesn't matter that you have a firewall if nobody's actively listening to what that firewall is saying, or if no one is reviewing the rules on that firewall periodically to make sure that it stays healthy. You know, it doesn't matter that you have a SOC even if nobody is actively responding to the things that they tell you. So you can have all these different things. You can go down the checklist and say, I've got this, I've got that, I've got this, I've got that. But at the end of the day, is it effective? Is it really actively helping me stop threats?
Yeah, Mac, and I think the only way you're going to identify that, right, is through the validation process. You know, if you're not validating it, you're not going to know. There's no such concept as you know, set it and forget it. And a lot of times, like, we'll go through, and whether it's using in the examples, right, installing endpoint or implementing access controls, things change, environments change, threats change, right? And being able to be dynamic enough to understand that and continually evolving and adapting to those tactics and validating that what you're implementing is working, I think is critical.
Yeah. So Lauren, I understand you have some questions now. What's your one?
Okay, so here's a question from the audience for Ben. What criteria should we use to risk rank our vendors for more frequent assessments, real-time monitoring, etc.?
So I think from my perspective, it's the criticality of what service that they provide is probably where I would start, right? I mean, you know, depending upon what they're doing for you, you know, the more serious it is to your business. If you lost that, for example, how would it impact your organization? Those are going to rank higher than perhaps maybe some of the janitorial services, as an example. You know, and so I mean, ultimately, it's your job as an organization to evaluate and build that list of criteria. But generally, it starts with what's most important to my success as an organization.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, you have to start with how critical is what they're doing for me to my business, and then you put them in categories, right? And you have folks that are hosting system, you have folks that are hosting critical systems, people that are just hosting systems, people that are providing a critical service, people that are just providing a service. You know, and once you understand the criticality, understand what they're doing, understand the uniqueness of it. For instance, if that is the only place that you're getting that is from that vendor, meaning you don't have it in-house as well, or some other avenue to receive it quickly, obviously that makes it even more of a risk situation, right? Once you understand that, then you can actually build out those models that Ben talked about earlier, using that RACI framework that says, for this particular vendor, these are the things that I need to know he's doing, that I'm going to be doing, that I'm accountable for, that he's accountable for, that I'm going to participate with him in terms of consulting on whatever it is he's doing. And then last but not least, the things that I need to see in order to be informed enough to know that relationship is effective and protected. Okay. Next question, Lauren.
Okay, next question. Can you talk about how you facilitate mapping supply chain to business processes of the care journey?
Dave, why don't you take that?
Yeah, it's actually a really good question, because it demonstrates ultimately you have to understand, you know, what are the things, the people, process, technologies that are supporting the ultimate care delivery journey in a health system. I would take a similar approach if I were looking at, you know, doing a business impact analysis, understanding from a business perspective, you know, what are the things that I do and need in order to you know, successfully complete that function or that process, and then come to a determination on how long can I last without that. So if you can look at the analysis that way and understand, okay, so from a supply chain perspective, whether it's truly just your ability, your internal processes to get materials and things into the system in order to produce care delivery, how long can you go without that? If it's in the supply chain process where you're inputting a vendor and that vendor is going to manage or store or process your PHI. It's understanding, what function is that providing for you, and then really determining, how long can I last without it? And if you can answer those questions, you can then understand what are the things that I need to have in place in order to make sure that I can, ultimately secure it appropriately, respond to an incident in a timely manner, and then make sure that I could recover that system or process in the event that I had some, damaging or catastrophic cyber event.
Okay. Lauren, we have another question.
Okay, another question is requesting kind of more of a statement on cybersecurity insurance.
So I'm going to give you kind of my biased opinion, and then I'm going to let Ben probably give you a more balanced answer. And here's the thing: having been a director of security and responsible for programs, and now on the other side helping organizations deal with this, insurance to me is just part of the solution. It's part of what I do to help prepare my organization or protect my organization in the event of occurrences. Insurance today typically only covers the cost of the breach, the response, things like notification, the forensic work that somebody has to come in and do, maybe perhaps a little bit of the front end in terms of fixing whatever happened right up front, but it rarely covers the real cost of a breach, right? So when I think of insurance, I don't think of insurance as a panacea to get me out of jail, so to speak, or to save me, right? So, and this gets back to what Ben was talking about earlier with respect to transference, right? I've never been a believer that you transfer responsibility. That's something that I owned as a director of security. It's something that you may own as a CISO or as a CIO or what have you. And you can't give that to somebody else. You'd like to sometimes, but you just can't. That's on you. So you have to make sure that you understand what each lever that you have is capable of delivering or contributing to your overall program. And insurance is a very viable and important part of your program, but you need to understand what it's capable of delivering and what it's not capable of delivering. And when you look at the cost of a breach today, or the overall cost of a breach today, it's really in the opportunity loss with respect to revenue. It's really all about the disruption to operations and what that costs us. It's about the long-term recovery from a financial perspective, and it has nothing to do with the initial breach. And so when I look at cyber insurance, yes, cyber insurance gets me through that piece at the front end. It may actually take care of me if it's a small breach and doesn't involve a lot of disruption or a lot of disclosure. But I'm going to really focus on my other security controls to take care of me in the event of a breach, because what I want to do is avoid or mitigate that long-term outage, that long-term disruption that really costs me a lot of money. Ben?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed hit the head on the nail, so to speak. I mean, insurance companies at the end of the day are there to make money, right? And so when you see insurance organizations dropping cyber coverage, it's because it's no longer profitable for them, which I think is a telltale sign that it becomes very expensive. And so, as they are increasing coverages, and like I had mentioned previously, the prerequisites in order for you to obtain them limit their exposure significantly. And so while I agree it's important that every organization has coverage, for me, if I'm responsible for that organization, I want to do whatever I possibly can to not use it, right? To me, it's there as more of a checklist, and I want to make sure that I have those prerequisites and the foundational implementation of technologies that are going to help prevent the compromise from happening in the first place, rather than using cyber insurance as a means of risk transfer, right? Because ultimately, like Max said, the cost, it's only going to cover a fraction of the cost if you're lucky. And so from that perspective, it's important to have. I think it's part of a balanced security program or plan, but ultimately I would focus my attention on the technologies and processes that are going to eliminate or help eliminate the need for it to be used in the first place.
Yeah. Well, listen, everybody, I know we're at the end of our time here, and I obviously want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank everybody for participating. I also want to thank the folks that provided questions there at the end, and I hope we'll see you again in September. And please come with questions. And if you think of something between now and then, you know what? Put it in that chat function right away when you come on, or the question function right away when you come on, and so we can answer it. And or if you have an idea for something that you'd like to talk about, or something you'd like us to talk about in more detail, again, suggest it, because we're open to that, and we want to talk about the things that are relevant and that are important to you. And we want this to be more of a dialogue back and forth if we can. So again, thank you very much for coming, and I want to hand it over now to Lauren to close this out.
All right. Thanks so much, Mac and Dave and Ben, for your presentations, and thanks to our viewers for attending August's briefing. The recording will be available in the event lobby by the end of today. Visit the link in the chat to view recorded content, slide shares, and to view details on HINS and Chime CEUs. Don't forget to check back with us on September 4th for our next briefing. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.